Well, here we are again, Renee. What's going on in our world right now?
Hey, so much is happening. So much is happening. We're at the beginning of May. I'm counting down personally the days till the outdoor pool is open, which is over Memorial Day weekend. And that is a huge summertime kickoff for me. So I'm getting pretty psyched because I can see the end in sight. We're almost to official warm weather where my pool opens, where I get to be outside. And that's my favorite time of year. So, what about you?
Absolutely. I've been fixing things lately. So not only, farming season going, but I had to replace my dishwasher. It seems like my dishwasher just quits every 3.5 or 4 years, and I just go buy another cheap one is kind of my strategy on that. And it took me more tools. I made more trips to my truck to get tools to put a dishwasher in. This should have been so simple. But I was able to take a quick 30, 45 minute project and turn it into a half day ordeal. So, I think it would have been more, it's getting to the point, maybe it's cheaper to hire somebody to do these things, but I refuse because those are the things you should be able to do on your own.
I'm pretty sure I know I cannot do that on my own. So 100% hiring people here. My challenge is when my husband thinks he can do it. And then I have to pretend like I'm supportive of
No,
that when I know full well it'd been cheaper if I'd have just hired somebody else. But
I saved money and I did it myself. So once again, I
uh-huh.
win.
And yet you replace them every 3 to 4 years. So there's that. So
That's not
today
my
we're
fault.
it's not your fault, right? What are we talking about today? Well, today we're going to talk about starting a new series, and this is what we're calling On the Road Again. Come summer, late spring, Jason and I are on the road for conferences, and 'tis the season for conferences that goes all summer into the fall. And we do a lot of conference talks on, especially with rural healthcare and behavioral health. We're always on the road. And I thought it'd be fun to kind of sit back and think of some of those things that we talk about on the conference trail and talk about what we talk about and then some of the stories we've heard along the way. And then, just remind our listeners of how that impacts them and what they might want to get out of that. Because at the end of the day, maybe they would need somebody that can come in and speak or to do some training. And we don't always talk about exactly what it is that we do. And I thought today we might kind of kick us off and start talking about that. So today, Jason, just you want to give everybody the background on how in the world did the two of us end up speaking all the time together? I know that's a good story, and I thought maybe our listeners would like to hear.
I think I've blocked some of this out, maybe for self-preservation. But let's go back and let's talk about it, right? Because this is really the fun part of what we get to do is going out and meeting people. The traveling that we get to do now. We started out doing this with it was COVID Recovery Iowa,
Mm-hmm.
then turned into Project Recovery Iowa. And we started out, talking to folks about their emotional response to the pandemic. And so,
Mm-hmm.
it's been over 4 years now since that started, and we're still feeling the impacts. And a lot of the messages we started talking about then are very relevant today when we think about burnout and chronic stress. So I think those first sessions where we went to conferences and we're writing abstracts and talking was really around how do we manage through a disaster.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there's so many disasters around us still today. A lot of our messages still hold true when it comes to businesses managing employees, to communities responding to disasters. And I think that's kind of where this all kicked off, isn't it, Renee?
Yeah. I get to laughing, but I think about one of the times you and I were speaking in Ames, and I don't know if you remember this, but we came off the stage and went out and talked to some of the vendors in the hall. And one of them says, "You two should have a podcast." I'd been thinking about it for a long time, and you had never been thinking about it. But that day, it just solidified in my mind. I'm like, yeah, we should have a podcast. And so it cracks me up. But yeah, I mean, I know I had during the COVID season, I had goals for myself of how many different stages I would speak on. And it was very easy not having to travel because it was all online. And then how many people I could impact from the stage. And so I would track numbers of people that, we would teach on a regular basis. And yeah, and what's interesting is like you said, the stuff that we started teaching then still applies today and now has some real good context to it because we've been tracking data through that whole time. And you could see the impact that the pandemic had and then post-pandemic and kind of some of the struggles we're still seeing all kind of come back from there. So it's been really a huge opportunity today. And one of the things, though, that we've always talked about, and I know this is one of your favorite things that you put in every presentation, is just what those statistics look like kind of post-pandemic and kind of where we are today. So I know that's a slide. If we were visual for everyone, you could see the slide that we use every time. But Jason, talk to us about where you get that information and then why you really like it.
I love it. And I just want to clarify one thing. I had thought about a podcast a lot prior to that person telling that to you, Renee, I had just thought about how I never wanted to do a podcast because I didn't think it was within my skill set. So there we are. And here I am today.
And today we are a podcast team. So there we go. That's
So
funny.
absolutely, I love talking about the data that's on the National Center for Health Statistics. Well, for a long time, they've measured the levels of anxiety and depression across the general population. It's broken down by age groups, by states. You can kind of parcel that data out any way that you want. And so it was during the pandemic where we're doing our work with the state of Iowa, where I started looking at it. I'm like, well, this is a great data point to talk to people because it validates everyone's experiences of feeling anxious and depressed. And when you feel like you're not alone, it's really helpful. And so, we started pulling that data, and I have in front of me a spreadsheet, and it goes back to when I first started pulling the data, and it was in June of 2020. I started going in there, and they at that time, every 2 weeks they were measuring this. They have researchers that do basically a call that goes out with standardized questions across the country, and then they come in and collate that data and push it out through that online portal at the National Center for Health Statistics. And so I go in and look at the state of Iowa's data, and then as we did more work in other states, I add other states to my Excel spreadsheet. And what I find fascinating to this is, the last data we just got was March of this year. And the level of anxiety and depression here in Iowa was still almost 23%. And that's still double of what it was in 2019. And so although, we peaked at 35, 40%, during the midst of the pandemic, here we are still double the rates of anxiety and depression across the general population. And we all know that impacts communities, workplaces, and pretty much all those people around us.
Yeah. Well, and that's what's so interesting is if you remember, I mean, we're now 4 years out from the peak, the start of the pandemic, I guess I would say. And everybody keeps talking about getting quote back to normal and when is normal. And we'll talk more about that in a second, but that's back to normal. And these particular trends are not changing. And so for the longest of times, I mean, we really were in that 30% plus range of people that were suffering with depression and anxiety. And so for it to have be trending downward now is awesome, but that's a very long recovery cycle for it to start like moving backwards. I mean, it's been 4 years. So, and what, I mean, I think about for myself, what that looks like is if you're out talking to people, you just notice people are kind of not as happy and they're generally more disgruntled and they're more likely to tell people off, especially on social media. And just, generally having a harder time. And you'll see that across the board. So, people are more snippy out in public and retail establishments and it's just everybody seems to be on edge all the time. And, we were really hoping as a collective of those of us that are pretty optimistic and trying to shoot for positive health that this trend would have changed, right after, quote, the pandemic was over 2 years ago or so. Or 18 months to 2 years and thinking, hey, let's go back to quote normal. And that's just not what happened. So Jason, why do you think that need has increased? And do you have any thoughts on why you think it's staying higher?
Well, I think that there's a lot of things we could talk about of why it's staying higher. And part of it, I think is that the world around us has just been very unsettled, for a good chunk of this time. And so I think that's impacting us. I also think that to some extent, the way that we now choose to recover personally, I think that there are greater boundaries being set. And so I see a lot, especially workplaces, of people just walking away. People are working their 40 hours and they're setting the boundary and just walking away. And so I think that's been part of the transition as we think about the transition in workplaces that, because of the prolonged duration of this anxiety and depression, we're starting to see people just try to take control of some aspect. And so it's setting better boundaries. And that's really changing then the way that society in some ways functions because those levels are staying still relatively high, double of what they were. And so now to manage, we're having to shift gears into different ways to manage what's probably long-term anxiety and depression, especially for those under age 30, because right, who's still impacting and reeling from this the most? It's the same as the folks who are most greatly impacted during the pandemic, but that was young people, right?
Right.
And the older that you were, the less impacted emotionally you were from the pandemic. And that research we've also seen over and over again repeated. And so we're still seeing that continuation even today, 4 years after the fact.
Yeah. And I know in workplace, the other thing I'm seeing is sort of a rebound. I don't know if I'd fully call it post-traumatic stress, but it's similar, maybe not as extreme, but a rebound effect if you have other challenges now after the pandemic. And I'll kind of give you an example. Our office had some challenges with ventilation and whatnot, and so we were going to need to be moved for a bit. And some of the information released was kind of scary. So some folks were more susceptible to being upset about it and whatever. But the way people worked in the pandemic has highly impacted how they've reacted now. So there were folks that were considered essential employees during the pandemic who still had to go into the building and still had to work and got, quote, left there or left behind is how they felt. And so now when they're going through a different type of issue, which is completely different, it's not COVID, we're not dying, nothing like that. But as soon as you have to think about relocation, there's immediately kind of this knee-jerk reaction to, whatever happened before, that it's not healed. And it's like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be left here by myself and I can't work from home and I can't. And so there's this level of panic. And this is not in that younger adult group. This is in an older, that people have been employed a very long time. But because of how all that worked with remote work and stuff, it's really fascinating when there's a challenge to watch different people react. And I think that is back to what you're saying about this underlying depression and anxiety and maybe not really resolved some of those issues. And so people are just more reactive to challenges. At least I have seen that 100% at my workplace.
I learned a new term yesterday, and I don't know if you've heard this yet or not, but have you heard about teenager leave?
No.
So there's a movement of parents who are now taking time outs from their occupations to go home and help their kids through junior high and high school because of that isolation over the last 4 years, that there's a lot of kids really struggling right now. And so you actually are starting to see movement. I was actually doing some corporate training just the other day. And their HR people say, yeah, we call that teenager leave because we're seeing middle-aged people with teenagers at home actually leaving the workforce at much higher rates. And so it used to be thought about people with young kids, and actually now that's shifted because of what we've seen throughout the pandemic. And so although that's anecdotal, I'm really interested to see if I can find any data on that, because I think that's a fascinating trend to pay attention to as we have this conversation, because it actually made a lot of sense to me. When I heard it, I'm like, I've heard a couple people tell me that in the past couple of months. And that actually makes a lot of sense because we know those kids, we see the data every day of the number of kids who are truant from school or school absences are through the roof right now nationwide. And so thinking about what now we need to do as parents, I thought was fascinating and an interesting connection point as we talk about these things.
Well, and you may not have thought of this yourself, but I mean, you've been able to work from home through this and have had your own family stuff through this exact thing, but you didn't have to take leave for it because you had some flexibility in your space. And where I am, we have family leave. And I absolutely see that happening with people using their family leave to support their teenage kids. And it's like getting them to their therapy appointments and maybe getting the employee themselves to their therapy appointments, but also making sure their kids are getting to their therapy appointments and having to use that family leave time. It'd be interesting to see if that's extended leave. I haven't seen that quite yet, but that wouldn't be maybe off the table. But it definitely, there's a group of folks that are just not doing so great after all of that. And I know we've said this in a previous podcast, but I'll say it again. Everybody who was so sure about lockdown and keeping kids out of school, man, that data has flipped. And everybody now at this point, 4 years out, are like, that was a terrible idea. Let's don't ever do it again, because you could see the developmental delays. And what's disheartening is there are people like us who could see it in advance. And so for people to have to watch it on the back end and watch that train wreck and sit there and go, this isn't going to go well, and watch the kids now really struggling because of how it went down, it's just heartbreaking, because we knew that social isolation wasn't good, and that social isolation is terrible for everyone, but it's real rough when you're in junior high, high school. And it's just bad. And so they're not quite as resilient at that time to be able to be completely separated with the additional social media pressures. I think had it been like back in our day, back in, the olden days when, if we were kicked out of school, we'd basically be running around the streets till dark with our friends, right? Because that's what you would have done back then. But now it's just very, very different with an online world. And that being the only connection people had. And what a mess. And so those are some of the things we're seeing. So my question to you, Jason, is, are we ever going to get back to normal?
Well, as I learned as I tore my dishwasher out, it reminded me, normal is only a setting on my dishwasher, right? We're never going to be back to anything because what is normal? We don't know what normal is, and I think this is part of the challenge is that there's some folks who really long to get back to what they knew before, and those days are long gone. And I think that's part of the anxiety we're seeing ongoing, is because there's so much transition that's happening all of the time, so especially in the workplace, right? And I think that's part of, our unique perspective as we go out and do the talks that we do and we talk about some of the work that we've done, especially in rural communities, is how do we set systems up for success and how do we help set workplaces up for success amidst all of these changes that's happened within their workforce? Because there's been a lot of pressures pushing folks around within those workforce confines, and especially as workforce becomes more limited and tighter in rural areas, because so many people have left the workforce for all of the reasons we just talked about, it makes those challenges even greater. And so workplaces have to rethink about what does a supportive environment look like? And it's a pretty big transition in some places where they haven't even considered some of the things that are now being asked of them by their employees. And sometimes employees aren't just asking, they're demanding, that I need these things to feel safe and to want to be engaged and to want to work here.
Right. I agree. And so one of the things you and I do a lot of training, but I'm going to speak positively about training because I've done this in my own office, is bringing in training. And I'm not really totally sure it matters what, it's more about the quality of the trainer, in my opinion. But like working around personalities has been immensely helpful because it gets people talking to each other about life other than at work. And well, you and I realize people, we aren't all alike, but some people don't know that until you show them that, hey, there's different personalities and they don't think like me. And man, has that been helpful. And it's been a lot of fun to watch people get to know each other better. And there's support in that because I'm learning as we've hit some challenges and some bumps at the office, what to expect from certain types of people, because now I have some language to put around it. And training for me is common language and then common understanding of what to expect, but then also how I can motivate and help. And so, some people I can, praise them all day long, but if that's not really motivating, then I'm wasting my time and theirs. And so figuring those things out. And so really taking that time to train and kind of dive in, especially since the pandemic, has really been helpful. And there are people older than myself working at my office who had never, ever, ever thought about some of this stuff. And some big light bulbs and big life decisions are happening because they're like, oh, put a name on is what's happening in my life. Oh, I should do something about that. And so, just by taking a step back. And so I'm a really big fan of training and making sure that that's, good training. I mean, bad training is not helpful, but good training. And so I know, Jason, you do a ton of it. So when you have been recently doing some more mental health first aid. So what are you seeing when you're doing training out there, talking to people? What are they saying regarding all of this?
Yeah, it's really about just creating a safe place to have an open conversation in your workplace. And, over and over again, people come up to me and I'm still shocked sometimes. I go into huge corporate settings of employers that are very well known, very well respected, have some of the best wellness programs literally across several states. And at the end of the training, the employees sometimes come to, they go, this is the first time I've felt like I could share some of the burdens I've experienced, or I could talk about the impact of the emotional well-being of my loved ones that I'm trying to support, or my own mental health challenges. And sometimes, we need to make it a safe place for our employees to understand where the boundaries are, right, within the
Mhm.
context of their employment, but to talk about the real challenges they face, because that's how you support people. And that common language is so important. So, when we're talking about, mental health first aid is a great example. It gives an opportunity for everyone to talk about how do we support each other in a way that makes sense, that helps us get toward our goals of a company, but takes care of us as people first. And I think that those are the types of strategies and trainings. And there's lots of ways we can do that, right? Sometimes it's just even a couple of hour training of just like, hey, here's some strategies you can use to help support employees. We see, especially with mid-level supervisors, employees come to them with their challenges, with the things they need, with those time off requests, and sometimes they just don't know what to say, how to support people. And there's not a right or wrong answer to it, but sometimes it helps when we all have common language, when we all understand what other supports we can help guide people to. when we all understand what the benefits of an EAP program are.
Mhm.
So, it's not always rocket science, Renee. Sometimes it's just making sure you have a third party as a messenger who can come in and help to carry that torch of what do we need to do to unify all of our employees.
Right. So, as you know, my background's in mental health and as a counselor therapist, and I was joking, but not joking, but I talked to the training folks on the state capitol complex and said, I don't know what I'm going to do because if I can't figure out training for them, I'm going to have to put them all like in a big group counseling session. Because I mean, it was more like, man, we got to process this stuff. So I'm either going to get some people in here to help me with this, or I'm not going to have much choice but to do it because there's just so much. And when you went through COVID and since then, just loss is different, grief is different. Some people didn't get to really grieve some of the things that happened during that period. And so for some folks that kind of got stuck in some of that, man, the workplace is just all kinds of stuff going on. And it may not be just in your department, but in people that you work with. And it's just a lot going on out there. And so listening is a big deal. But it really ties into my self-care policy of the week. And you'll understand how these two things tie together. But sometimes I have to close my door or work from home. I have been told that I'm a person that, because of who I am and what I do and all of that, that everybody can tell me anything. And I swear it's written on my forehead, tell me everything. And that's awesome. I love that trait, or it's a superpower in my opinion. I learn lots of things about lots of people, but there's times when it's just overwhelming for me to hear it all and to not, I'm not the fixer of everything. And so it's just sometimes I just have to like, you know what, I could still be supportive, but not overly so, and be able to have more like open door hours or office hours and, and have closed door time, because the job that I am required to do now requires a lot of thinking and a lot of quiet time. And that can't happen if everybody's in my office all the dang time. Right. And so sometimes if I just don't come in the office, I have more quiet time. And so I, again, will always say as a self-care thing to have yourself a mentor or a coach. But I have a coach right now who just reminded me, hey, your strength and your gift is that quiet thinking. That's how you process. And if you're not getting that, you're not going to be balanced and healthy and doing the things you need to do. And I'm like, oh yeah. So it's not like I didn't know it, but when you're in the middle of it, sometimes you forget. So for me, having that coach and just saying sometimes you have to be less available. And that sounds counterintuitive sometimes because leaders want to be available for their team, but sometimes you have to take a step back. So Jason, does that bring up any thoughts for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's part of just that emotional IQ and self-awareness that we all need to really nurture in ourselves.
Mhm.
And it's so important to get feedback from others. And sometimes that's really hard to take in. But I think, like you said, everyone should have a coach. Everyone should have a mentor because those are the activities we need so that we can stay on track at any given time.
Yeah. So today we started sort of a new series that we're going to be talking about. And then the other part of the series is going to be bringing on some interviews of some of people that we know and work in our lives that are really important in the mental health space for lots of variety. It's going to be really fun because they're very varied in backgrounds and people. But right now we're talking about the conference season. And today we just talked about some of the things and the information that we do when we are out on the road that people still continue to have lots of great feedback on. And that's thinking about the data on mental health and anxiety through and since the pandemic. And a lot of people think, well, that sounds like nothing very exciting, but you'd be surprised. And it impacts how you work at work. It impacts your personal life. It impacts your family. And so it's really important information. And then we talked about some training and how training is a useful tool. And Jason and I do some of those trainings. We know other people who are awesome trainers. So if you're out there listening today and you're thinking, maybe I need to dive into this more where I am, feel free to reach out. If we're not the right people to match you up with, we definitely would get you the resources of who'd be the right people, because we want to make sure that you and your employees are taken care of the way they need to be. And there's a lot of conversations to be had and a common language to be found by all. Well, thanks again for listening. Have a great day, everybody.